Actually, before introducing our speaker for the evening today, it is my great pleasure to congratulate, and I'm sure you will all join me in congratulating Mr. Shomendranath Mukherjee, Gopalda, and Ambarish Dasgupta, our just elected president and vice president at today's AGM, which was earlier on in the evening. So congratulations, Gopalda and Ambarish. Professor Prabhat Patnaik, our speaker today on the topic neoliberal capitalism is at a dead end, is a highly respected Indian political economist known particularly for his advocacy of measures to directly improve the lives of the poor. He studied at St. Stephen College, Delhi, and at Oxford on scholarships and moved to the University of Cambridge in 1969 to join the Faculty of Economics and Politics and accepted a fellowship at Clare College. He returned to India in 1974 as an associate professor at the newly established Center for Economic Studies and Planning at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi and became a professor there in 1983. He continued at the JNU until his retirement from the Shukumar Chakraborty chair in 2010. Between 2006 and 2011, Professor Patnaik was the executive head of the planning board in the state of Kerala. During his tenure, the state saw significant expansion in welfare measures. After the financial crisis in 2008, Professor Patnaik was appointed to an interactive panel by the President of the UN General Assembly with the task of discussing the crisis and recommending reforms of the global financial system. He has, of course, written many books, including Time, Inflation and Growth, Macroeconomics, which he edited, and Re-envisioning Socialism. He has been honored by various academic institutions and has held many visiting professorships. It is indeed our very good fortune to have him with us here today. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to address such a distinguished gathering. I'm really honored by the invitation to me. The topic I have chosen today is neoliberalism at a dead end. And I have chosen it because this is a topic on which there has been a certain amount of discussion in the West, but none whatsoever, to my knowledge, in India. Let's see what neoliberalism involved. In fact, the globalization which unleashed neoliberal policies involved was an enormous mobility of capital, including finance, across countries. For the first time in the history of capitalism, you actually had capital moving to less developed countries, Asian countries, for instance, not to meet the local market, not to set up factories to meet the local market, but rather to set up factories to meet global demand. And it was moving in response to the low wages prevailing in these countries relative to the metropolitan economies. Now, this, as we know, resulted in a substantial flow of manufacturing facilities, services to India, manufacturing facilities to countries like China, Vietnam, Indonesia, and so on. And this basically resulted in fairly high rates of growth. I'm not saying immediately, but directly and indirectly stimulated fairly high rates of growth in all these economies. Therefore, neoliberalism, which was the policy under this era of globalization, ushered in a regime of high growth based essentially upon the outsourcing of activities from metropolitan countries to countries of this sort, particularly in Asia. Now, this had one very important implication. If you have activities shifting out of the metropolis to low-wage third world countries, then you'd find that wages in the metropolis cannot rise because effectively workers there are competing against workers in the third world countries, which are, of course, much lower paid workers, located in the midst of fairly substantial labor reserves, enormous backlog of unemployment, underemployment, and so on. And therefore, you'd find that the wages in the metropolis, real wages, did not go up because of the competition that was exerted by the mobility of capital to third world countries. Not that the wages in the metropolis and the wages in the third world countries got equalized, but on the other hand, what you found is that the vector of real wages did not go up if you take the world as a whole. In the advanced countries, they did not go up because of competition from the low-wage countries. And in the low-wage countries, they did not go up because, notwithstanding all the shift that took place in activities to these countries, their labor reserve did not get exhausted. In India, for instance, we had very high rates of growth for a period, but on the other hand, that really generated an employment growth rate that was even lower than the natural rate of growth of the workforce. Therefore, your labor reserve, your backlog of unemployment, underemployment, and so on, grew rather than declining, which basically meant that your real wages continued to remain stuck at some kind of a subsistence level. Therefore, taking the world economy as a whole, the vector of real wages really did not go up. On the other hand, you find that the vector of labor productivity everywhere went up quite significantly. Because of this, you find that the share of non-wage income in the total income is something that started rising quite substantially. Profits, other kinds of professional incomes, what we generally would refer to as surplus, non-wage surplus incomes, started rising relative to wages during this period of globalization. Now, this is something which was a global phenomenon, and it basically underlies the significant increase in income and wealth inequality that you find over this period. Now, this is something which has been commented on by everybody. Thomas Piketty has been writing about it. You find that, for instance, even Christine Lagarde, who, when she was the managing director of the IMF, was concerned about it. You find that even the World Economic Forum has expressed significant amount of disquiet about this substantial rise in income and wealth inequality that has occurred over this period. Underlying that, to my mind, is the fact that the mobility of capital and therefore the outsourcing of activities has basically meant that the vector of real wages all over the world has remained unchanged, while the vector of labor productivities has gone up. As you know, real wages divided by labor productivity is the same as the share of wages. So, if you have this happening, then it has a very important implication. That implication is that suppose you shift a rupee from a worker to, let us say, a rich person. In that case, out of that rupee, the worker will be consuming much of the rupee. Okay, I mean, in other words, maybe consuming 90 paise. But on the other hand, when you shift it to the hands of a relatively better off person, you shift it, for instance, as profits, or you shift it as, let's say, surplus income, you shift it as income of a rich lawyer, then you find that out of the rupee, the lawyer or the capitalist will in fact consume, let us say, half a rupee and keep the other half for future use, which is what economists call savings. Therefore, the savings ratio out of a rupee in the hands of the better off person is much higher than the savings ratio in the hands of a worker, of a working or a working person. Therefore, any such increase in income inequality tends to dampen the level of consumption. It tends to slow down the rate of growth of consumption. It tends to produce a lower growth of consumption over time. And if it produces a lower growth of consumption, there's no reason why investment should increase correspondingly to offset this. Investment, after all, depends upon the growth of demand. So if consumption growth slows down, in that case, the investment profile remaining unchanged, you'd find that the overall demand slows down. Output tends to slow down, because of which investment also would tend to slow down. And therefore, there's a general tendency towards greater involuntary unemployment, as Keynes had talked about. So the shift in income distribution away from wages to non-wage incomes is something that has a dampening effect on the level of demand in the world economy as a whole. Now, this should not normally be much cause for concern, because after all, this dampening effect can be offset through larger state expenditure. Okay, if consumption is not going down, the government can always spend more. It can spend more either by taxing the savings of the rich, part of which falls on their savings, or by simply engaging in deficit financing, enlarging the fiscal deficit, in which case whatever demand slows down because of the consumption side would be or can be made more or can be more or less offset through an increase in state expenditure. This is what Keynes had taught, where they maintain fairly high levels of employment because of state intervention in what was called demand management. But now, see the implications of this. You see, finance does not want an activist state. It does not want the running of a fiscal deficit. We know that all over the world, except in the United States, there is fiscal responsibility legislation that your fiscal deficit cannot be more than 3% of your GDP. Just imagine, we don't have a legislation saying that your health expenditure should not be less than 3% of GDP. We don't have a legislation saying that your education expenditure should not be less than 6% of GDP. But we do have a legislation that actually says that your fiscal deficit cannot be more than 3% of GDP. Why? Because that is the kind of thing that finance wants, and generally it's referred to as keeping up the confidence of the investors. Basically, it means that making your economy a hospitable place for these financial flows, in which case you would not have sudden outflows of finance. Now, this kind of thing, the fact that an activist state demand management is something which might actually be prevented if the economy was dominated by finance, was recognized by Keynes himself. In 1933, he wrote an article in the Yale Review in which Keynes said that finance above all must be national. If it is national, in that case, the state can actually control the movements of finance. As a matter of fact, under the Bretton Woods system that preceded the current globalization, finance was actually controlled because you had capital controls by every country. In India, we had very strict capital controls. You referred to my going to Oxford. When I went to Oxford as a student, those days you were given a P form by the RBI. And that P form allowed me to carry with me 3 pounds, literally 3 pounds, with which I landed up for the first time I was going abroad in a completely new country. And that money was completely exhausted. My flight was in the evening. Once I had spent the night in a bed and breakfast place and purchased a ticket by a coach to go to Oxford from London, that money had completely run out. So that was the kind of strictness of capital controls which the Bretton Woods system allowed. It was not as if India was doing something out of the ordinary. So the Bretton Woods system, as you know, was set up by Keynes, among others. Therefore, he was very clear that if the state has to have sufficient jurisdiction over the economy in order to actually control the level of demand, in order to make sure that the economy operated at a fairly high level of employment, then the state must control finance. Finance, above all, must be national. Now what has happened is that we have nation states. We have the Indian state, we have the Polish state, we have whatever. We have nation states, but finance is globalized because of the fact that now it can move across country borders with ease. Now, if finance is globalized and the state is a nation state, then the nation state must pursue only those policies which finance approves of, because otherwise there would be a huge outflow of finance from your country and you would actually be facing a huge financial crisis. Therefore, willy-nilly, no matter what the government is, whether it's a left government or right government or a centrist government, as long as it remains within this orbit of globalized finance, then you'd find that it would have to pursue the same policies, as the other governments are pursuing. Now, this basically implies controlling the fiscal deficit. And of course, you cannot tax the capitalists, you cannot tax the corporate sector, because that is one way. Suppose the government raise taxes at the expense of the corporate sector worth 100 rupees and spend those 100 rupees, there would be a net increase in demand, because as I said, the corporate's demand would not go down by 100 rupees, while the government expenditure would add 100 rupees to a demand. But this net addition is also not possible, because if you tax the corporate sector, if you introduce a wealth tax, if you introduce any taxation on the rich, in that case, you would immediately find that there would be a loss in the investment in the confidence of the investors, and therefore there would be a financial outflow. You may well remember that actually when Pranab Mukherjee was the finance minister of India, he had introduced a measure to prevent the Mauritius route. If you look at foreign direct investment into India, you find that the country from which all this foreign investment, bulk of foreign investment comes to India is Mauritius. Now, what is Mauritius up to? Basically, what you find that all these countries, all these big corporates, big multinational corporations, they may be based in London, they may be based anywhere, but they have an office in Mauritius, and that Mauritius office invests in India. Now, because we have a double taxation avoidance treaty with Mauritius, we therefore don't tax them if Mauritius has taxed them. But Mauritius has virtually zero taxation. As a result, in order to save on taxation, they all route their investment through Mauritius. When Pranab Mukherjee tried to block the Mauritius route by saying that, look, let's look at where their headquarters are, not whether the money is coming from the Mauritian office, then of course you would remember there was a huge outcry and so on, and this had to be withdrawn. So the point is that the typical means of enlarging state expenditure and therefore state intervention in boosting demand, which is through either a fiscal deficit or taxation of savings, which basically means taxation on the rich, are really out when the state is the nation state and finance is globalized. Now, therefore, this tendency towards a slowing down of demand, this tendency towards deficiency of aggregate demand, uh, tripping up the system, is something which cannot be checked by the state, as it was done that this offset to the tendency for demand to slow down is no longer operative. You cannot, for instance, after the collapse of the housing bubble, you cannot, for instance, order an asset price bubble. You can't hold a gun to somebody's head and say, now speculate and buy this asset. This is exactly what has happened. People, after the collapse of the housing bubble, the world economy has been slowing down. One very obvious indicator of this is, of course, the unemployment rate. Now, you may ask me the question, and this is an interesting point, that you see, Donald Trump said the other day, quite rightly, that the unemployment rate in the US today is at 3.5%, which is the lowest it has been over the last 50 years. Okay. So then his point, when I said today, I mean before the pandemic. So the point that would be asked is that all right, but if that is the case, what crisis are you talking about? What slowing down are you talking about? Well, you actually look at the American data and you find that really there has been a substantial drop in the participation rate, in the proportion of the population in the working age group that actually reports itself as the workforce. Now, this is something which tends to happen in a period in which there are not enough jobs going. This is called the discouraged worker effect. If you made an adjustment to have the same participation rate today as existed in 2008, then you'd find that the unemployment rate in the US today is 8%, which is a fairly large unemployment rate. And likewise in other countries, other OECD countries and so on. So that is one clear index. The other clear index is that you find that the terms of trade of primary commodities, agricultural goods, metallic goods, minerals and so on, have really come down sharply from 2011 onwards. Between April 2011 and December 2019, before the pandemic began, there's a 38% fall in the prices in what is called the all commodity price index that is prepared by the IMF. So there's a very sharp fall. And why does such a fall occur? Because in the world economy as a whole, the demand for primary commodities goes down and their prices are highly sensitive to demand. By the way, much of the third world debt that you hear about is because of this fall in primary commodity prices. When there is such a fall, then you find that countries, in order to maintain whatever imports they were making, then start borrowing from other countries. So this burgeoning third world debt is a reflection of the fall in primary commodity prices. Then you find that countries like China and India, which were very rapidly growing economies during that period of neoliberal globalization in its heyday, are countries where actually the growth rate has slowed down, both in China and in India. In India, of course, we are more familiar with the Indian data. As you know, in India, I'm not talking about the pandemic. Before the pandemic, the unemployment rate that you found last year was the highest it had ever been in over the last 45 years. If you look at consumption data, consumption expenditure data, you find that the real per capita consumption expenditure in rural India per capita, the average was 9% lower in 2017-18 compared to 2011-12. So there is growing distress, growing unemployment, growing indebtedness of third world. You find declining primary commodity prices, and you also find that there is growing unemployment even in the advanced countries. All these are symptoms of the depression, symptoms of a slowing down of the world economy, symptoms of a sort of creeping crisis, which arises for reasons that I have been talking about. Now, the pandemic came in the midst of it. And of course, during the pandemic, the rise in unemployment has been phenomenal, and so on. So that I don't have to say, everybody knows about it. But we must not get the impression that when the pandemic is over, we can really go back to the world from where we had started, or the world that the pandemic had actually interrupted, because of this phenomenon, namely that world itself was characterized by a crisis. And of course, the second technical phenomenon, namely that when the world gets caught by a pandemic, recovery from it anyway takes a very long time. Even if there's a recovery in consumption, recovery in investment takes a very long time, because investment occurs only when capacity utilization has increased sufficiently. Capacity utilization increases only when investment increases. So it's a chicken and egg problem, because of which there's a very slow process of recovery. Now, therefore, the world today is placed in a situation where we clearly, when we come out of this pandemic, for both the reasons I'm talking about, the technical reason, namely the recovery in any case is prolonged, and for the other reason, namely that actually there was a slowing down of the world economy earlier. There was a kind of creeping recession in the world economy earlier. For both these reasons, it is clear that the old policies cannot really work. Now, this is something which many people in the advanced countries have been talking about. For instance, the Financial Times, which is a highly respectable journal of the British establishment, and in fact, of the international establishment, probably there does not exist as prestigious a financial newspaper anywhere in the world. The Financial Times has been writing a series of editorials in which it has been drawing attention exactly to this phenomenon. I'll read out to you an editorial which it wrote on April 3rd. This in quotes: radical reforms in reversing the prevailing policy direction of the last 4 decades will need to be put on the table. Governments will have to accept a more or less active role in the economy. They must see public services as investment rather than as liabilities, and look for ways to make the labor market less insecure. Redistribution will again be on the agenda. Policies until recently considered eccentric, such as basic income and wealth taxes, will have to be in the mix. Now, this is what the Financial Times editorial report wrote on April 3rd. Subsequently, again, it had an editorial on July 8th, in which it actually argued that the world today is, if you like, is facing a sort of Keynes-Roosevelt moment. You know, in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, Roosevelt had introduced the New Deal. And the New Deal was something which involved the state in stimulating demand in the economy. And the argument was that to keep the capitalist system going, to keep it alive. Keynes was in fact utterly anti-socialist. His whole idea was that capitalism had to be preserved against the threat which he saw as emanating at that time from the socialist countries and so on, because Bolshevik Revolution had happened and so on. So because of that, he wanted capitalism to be stabilized, and as a votary of capitalism, he wanted state intervention in increasing employment. I mean, he actually said the world will not much longer tolerate the levels of unemployment which capitalism generates. So if you want to preserve capitalism, you have to have a capitalism that does not generate those levels of unemployment. And Roosevelt had actually given expression to this idea through his New Deal. And of course, as a matter of fact, he had to do it against massive opposition of finance. By the way, this idea was opposed massively by finance in the 1930s. Keynes was an Englishman, but in England, there were no takers for his theory in England. As a matter of fact, I mean, he was a very important person, but on the other hand, nobody took his ideas seriously. It was only after the Second World War, when a Labour government came to power, that it actually introduced some of these Keynesian measures to make sure that unemployment remained as low as possible. So the point is that, again, as I said, the Financial Times has been arguing that the world again is facing a Keynes-Roosevelt moment, that it is important that there be state intervention in promoting the level of activity, stimulating the economy so that unemployment comes down and so on. Now this, they all emphasize, is not because they believe that free markets are a bad thing. On the contrary, they believe that free market capitalism, in order to survive, you must actually make sure that this freedom is somewhat tempered through state intervention in generating appropriate levels of demand. That to preserve free market capitalism, it is important to have state intervention. As a matter of fact, these ideas were then, I mean, are in the process of becoming a part of British economic policy. Just the other day, Boris Johnson, who's the Prime Minister of Britain, actually said that, look, we have to have public investment. That is very important to have public investment. In order to have public investment, we have to raise taxes on the rich. And Boris Johnson said that, that he made exactly the same point, that it is essential to have state intervention in order to prop up free market capitalism. But he began his speech by saying, believe me, I'm not a communist. But on the other hand, I believe that it is important to have public investment. It is important to have taxation, greater taxation of the rich, exactly like Financial Times was saying. Now, the point I'm trying to make, whether this can actually be introduced in the advanced countries or not is a moot point. As a matter of fact, the opposition of finance or globalized finance to an activist state, which was there in the 1930s, which has been there all along in the immediate post-war period, it was a bit of a different situation because there was a shift in the political, there was increase in the political weight of the working class. In Britain, for instance, Winston Churchill, who was the wartime prime minister, lost the elections. Similarly, in France and Italy, you had communist parties forming, being part of the government. In Britain, the Labour Party was part of the government. So there was an increase in the political weight of the working class, which kind of counteracted the opposition of finance to introduce these policies. But now, if you want to bring back on the argument that the world is again seeing a Keynes-Roosevelt moment, similar policies of state intervention and so on, there would be opposition by finance, and finance that is now globalized, as I mentioned earlier. So it's not going to be easy. Obviously, it's not going to be easy to introduce these measures, even though very important segments of the establishment see the need for these measures. But what happens in the advanced countries is something which, of course, is very important for us, because to the extent that they remain mired in crisis and we remain wedded to neoliberal policies, that crisis would also impinge on us. But that is, if we remain wedded to neoliberal policies, we could, for instance, take an initiative. We could, for instance, activate the state as an investor, the kind of things that even Boris Johnson is saying, have larger public investment, have larger public expenditure for welfare, for healthcare, for instance, for education, all of which would meet our social priorities, and you can finance it through taxes on the corporate, through wealth taxes, or even through a fiscal deficit. At the moment, it would not matter because we have substantial unutilized capacity and unemployment. So we could do that by getting the weight of finance off our backs by introducing, if necessary, capital controls, which of course I believe would be necessary, but we could actually introduce capital controls whenever they become necessary. But that would mean, in some sense, withdrawing from the world of globalized finance. That would entail, for instance, withdrawing from the world of financial flows. But what I am worried about is that this debate is not happening in our country. As a matter of fact, the government is simply going ahead and doing exactly the same things. Namely, it believes that you can come out of this crisis even after the pandemic is over. You can come out of this crisis by curtailing labor rights. And I read out to you the Financial Times editorial, which actually said, and look for ways to make the labor market less insecure. So Financial Times is talking about introducing security in the labor market, while we are talking about introducing greater flexibility in the labor market. So we are actually caught in a time warp. We are actually caught in a kind of thinking where we think attacking labor rights, giving corporate taxation, tax relief, and simply inviting multinationals to come here, make it easy for them to get hold of land, to set up their industry and so on, is the way that we can come out of the crisis. Now that is a race to the bottom, because all countries that believe in this way of overcoming the crisis would be countries which would all be taking such measures, and therefore it's a race to the bottom. Your labor rights you have reduced. Now I'm going to reduce my labor rights to an even greater extent, and then I'm going to give even greater corporate tax concessions. I'm going to make land grab even easier in my country compared to what some other country has done. So that's a race to the bottom, and it would not succeed in overcoming the crisis. If anything, it would only succeed in accentuating the crisis. I'll just give you an example. Again, suppose you give out what I think 1.5 lakh crores was the tax concession which the government gave to the corporate sector. Now, when you give tax concessions of 1.5 lakh crores to the corporate sector, if the government manages to retain its fiscal deficit target, it will have to curtail its expenditures by an appropriate, to an equivalent extent. Therefore, 1.5 lakh crores of government expenditures have been curtailed. When you give 1.5 lakh crores of corporate tax relief, they are not going to spend the entire 1.5 lakh crores of corporate tax relief they have got. Therefore, what they are going to spend is only going to be a part of it, while the government's reduction of expenditure would be the whole of it, because of which there would be a net reduction in aggregate demand that would actually worsen the crisis. So these measures, apart from involving a race to the bottom, apart from being iniquitous, are also infructuous. They're not even going to work, because of which I think it's very important for us to think about these issues, to debate these issues, and to develop a new consensus, at least, a new consensus around the need for greater government involvement, at least in promoting welfare expenditures, in promoting healthcare expenditure, education, and so on and so forth, financed through specifically wealth taxation. In India, there is no wealth taxation at all, virtually, and therefore this is a new direction we have to think about. And in that sense, the old neoliberal policies that we have been pursuing till now are, in my view, passé. I think I should stop there. Thank you very much, and I'll take some questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Patnaik. It was a very fascinating speech. Our members have already asked some questions from Mr. Pradeep Kakkar. When we look at the track record of government delivering public services in India, health, education, air quality, and even gender equality, it is rather dismal. Yet we would like government to be an active investor. Are we asking for more crony capitalism?
The point is that crony capitalism arises through privatization. In other words, when the government spends on healthcare, Nobody can accuse All India Institute of Medical Sciences of crony capitalism. But there would be crony capitalism to the extent that government land is handed over to some private hospital on the argument that a quarter of the beds would be for economically weaker sections, which is never fulfilled. So then, that is crony capitalism. Now let's come to the question of whether government services are efficient, inefficient, and so on. Firstly, we have to make careful comparisons. But the point is that government health care is free, virtually free. Now, the private healthcare costs a fortune. I mean, we have seen this during this entire COVID-19 crisis. In Delhi, there is a ceiling of 17,000 rupees a day, which a hospital can charge to a COVID-19 patient for tests and everything together. That's silly. 17,000 rupees. How many people, how many villagers from neighboring states who come to Delhi? All India Institute of Medical Sciences is flooded with such people. How many such people can afford 17,000 rupees a day? Therefore, public health care is something which is free or almost free, while private health care is extremely expensive. And as a matter of fact, let me tell you that, that when I was in Kerala, we found that, you see, a lot of the peasant suicides that happen. Peasant suicides are happening because the peasants take loans. Why do they take loans? They don't take necessarily loans to improve agriculture. They take loans because their father fell ill and had to be taken to a private hospital. They take loans because their son fell ill. And therefore, a lot of the loans, or the non-payment of which led to suicides, were actually incurred for healthcare expenditures. So public services are important for that reason. Public education is important for that reason. Public healthcare is important for that reason. Quite apart from the fact that these are also areas in which other things, like, for instance, reservations, affirmative action can be practiced, which cannot be done in the private sector.
From Professor Amita Chatterjee, do you think that radical reforms can at all be sustained within a neoliberal frame, even if in its new avatar?
In fact, I do not believe that. That's exactly my argument. That's what, let's say, Boris Johnson would like to believe. Obviously the radical reforms themselves mean a change in the neoliberal frame. But the question is asking, and effectively what it is saying, is that to what extent radical reforms are sustainable in a world in which, if you like, the political weight of finance remains what it is, in which the kind of, that can finance be persuaded to drop its objections to state activism? I believe no. I really believe that it cannot be. As a matter of fact, Keynes had believed that finance can be persuaded. He had believed that the opposition of finance to radical reform, particularly to a fiscal deficit, was based on bad theory. Is because they don't understand. His idea was that you listen to my theory. I have shown you that it can do no harm if used up to a certain kind of safe limit. But on the other hand, this is something they don't understand. Once they understand, then they'll drop their objection. But they did not drop their objections. As a matter of fact, we have seen the last 40 years have been marked by the hegemony of finance and the deactivation of state stimulus.
From Mr. Gautam Gupta, I know you have not mentioned Marx today, instead going with Keynes all along, but are you saying that Marx's crisis due to underconsumption is now finally kicking in? Provocative.
Yes, I mean, I'm talking about Keynes because of the fact that I was referring to the Financial Times and I was referring to Boris Johnson and so on, to argue that even they are now seeing the kind of problems which we in our country still, our governments are not seeing, or our media is not seeing. Now, yes, of course, the very basic proposition which I put forward is something which is a Marxian proposition, namely that that if you have a shift from wages to surplus, or wages to profits, or wages to non-wage income, in that case, that tends to slow down the growth of consumption and therefore involve the economy in a efficiency of aggregate demand. And this is basically sometimes referred to as underconsumption, or you can call it an overproduction crisis, tendency to overproduction. I believe, I know Gautam well, I'd like to tell Gautam that I'm trying to put forward a theory of global overproduction or global underconsumption.
From Oyun
This
Chaudhary.
is operating at the global level. Yes, please.
From Oyun Chaudhary, you mentioned that one cannot hold a gun to someone's head and force an asset price bubble. But isn't that what is exactly happening now after the COVID crisis, in which where central banks at the moment are coordinating an unprecedented amount of liquidity injection, keeping rates super low and consequently pushing up both debt and equity prices to levels beyond that which makes economic sense?
Absolutely. You see, governments, but you see, they are not putting guns. They are actually providing inducements in the form of lowering the interest rate. That's exactly what this entire race to lower the interest rates is all about. We used to study, I mean, if you're a student of economics, we used to study that basically lowering the interest rate is a way of making credit cheap. And if credit is cheap, people are going to make more investment. As a matter of fact, these days, monetary policy operates by lowering the interest rate, not because anybody believes that this is going to give rise to larger investment, but because lowering the interest rate would give rise possibly to an asset price bubble, that possibly it will give rise to greater speculation. Naturally, if you believe that the interest rate is zero, and you believe that, let's say, the stock market is going to rise by 5% over the coming year, or the coming months, in that case, I would rather borrow and invest in the stock market. And once I do that, others do that, then there would be a bubble. But even that is not happening. As a matter of fact, the US Fed policy now is even more kind of, is actually trying to put a floor to the prices of financial assets. It is actually now making the Fed buy financial assets. In every way, they're trying to stimulate a bubble. But on the other hand, it is not really working, partly because of the fact that, that once bitten, twice shy. You see, the collapse of the housing bubble has meant that really nobody now can have that kind of sanguine ideas about asset prices anymore. People are much more careful. They actually pull out of the market before asset prices have risen too high. And what is more, even when asset prices do rise, the effect it has on the real economy. I said, the wealth effect, that basically my wealth is a lot more today because the assets I hold, the financial paper I hold is something which is priced at 10 times what it was yesterday. Now, even that kind of thing is something which is not really being as significant. Its impact on the real economy is much less. And what is more, the bubble itself is not really key.
A question from Ananda Bose. This is somewhat different. You talk quite rightly about the need for developing global consensus. How do you think, looking at the state of global leadership today, consensus can be developed?
Let me just go. Okay, suppose I was an advisor to one of the capitalist governments in the world today. What would I advise? One way of actually preserving the system is, if you have globalized finance, then if you had a global state, then the global state could take on globalized finance and impose its will against the dictates of globalized finance. And one way of generating a globalized state is to generate a surrogate global state in which you have agreements among all the major advanced countries to enlarge government expenditure, to enlarge the fiscal deficit. By the way, this had been suggested in the 1930s by Keynes and a group of German trade unions, a coordinated fiscal stimulus, coordinated across the richer countries. But on the other hand, nobody is even talking about it. Yes, the other day, I know that European Union provided, a fiscal stimulus of 1.8 trillion euros, a coordinated EU stimulus. But on the other hand, people are very skeptical about what it actually means and so on. But anyway, but a coordinated global stimulus is something which nobody is really even talking about. They weren't talking about it in the 1930s, and they are not even talking about it now. In the 1930s, the crisis actually came to an end, not because of the New Deal, because Roosevelt withdrew from the New Deal fairly soon under financial pressure, because of which in America in 1937 there was again another recession. And finally, the capitalist world came out of it because of the Second World War, the armaments expenditure and so on. But today, nobody did this idea of a coordinated global stimulus. Even today, nobody is even talking about a coordinated global stimulus. So I would agree with you that you need a global effort. But on the other hand, this is something which is not being talked about. This is something which is outside the ken even of the advanced capitalist countries.
Professor Patnaik had indicated that he has about 10 more minutes, so I'm just going to ask the three last questions from this panel. From Rajiv Bandyopadhyay, do we have any chance to see end of abject poverty in our country in our lifetime, say within the next 20 to 25 years?
You know, that honestly, that is a question that depends on us. If we put pressure on the government, if we put, I mean, if we intervene politically, by we, I mean, okay, you, me, everybody else. Once we generate an opinion on this, then poverty is very easy to get rid of, by the way. Amartya Sen had argued that you need 5% of the GDP to get rid of poverty. As a matter of fact, I calculated that suppose you introduce 5 economic rights, fundamental economic rights, right to food, right to employment, failing employment, you give them a wage, right to, kind of free, publicly funded healthcare through a national health service, right to free, publicly funded education, at least up to the secondary level, and old age pension, a living old age pension and disability benefits. By living, I mean 3,000 rupees per month. So if you do that, you require, in addition to what is being spent on all kinds of heads, even on these days on these, 10% of the GDP. 10% of GDP can be raised by a combination of just 2 taxes. Well, to spend 10%, you actually raise taxes. You need to raise taxes of only 7%. That's because of Keynes's multiplier and so on. That if you, if you spend 7%, some of it comes back to you as taxes and so on. So that with 7% additional revenue, you can spend 10% extra. So the 7% can be raised by just 2 taxes. 2% wealth tax on the top 1% of the population, just the 1%, and 1/3 inheritance tax on, again, the top 1% of the population. In India, we have no inheritance tax. And of course, our wealth tax has virtually disappeared. In Japan, I'm told they have 80% inheritance tax. That that if I die, the amount I leave to my child is something from which the state takes a share. That share is very high in advanced countries because they believe that, look, your wealth, they're capitalist countries, that your wealth may be deserved by you, because you are a talented person, you have some qualities as a capitalist. But your child has to prove his worth again, and therefore you cannot simply bequeath your entire property to your child. The state takes away a part of it. In India, we have no such thing. So just these 2 taxes, a 2% wealth tax and a 1/3 inheritance tax, levied on the top 1% of the population, is enough to give these 5 basic rights, which would of course involve an elimination of poverty. But so getting rid of poverty is not the problem. But the point is that we have to put pressure on the governments. We have to have such governments which have the political will to do this.
The last 2 questions, Professor Patnaik. From Nandita Chatterjee, In your opinion, which are the core sectors where the state should invest to address investor sentiment as well as trigger employment?
Well, I mean, okay, that's a very complicated question. Put it this way, I believe that state investment in India should not be only by the central government or only by the state government. It has to be dispersed. It has to be at the level of the panchayats, at the level of the local self-governing institutions and so on. So that I believe in much more dispersed state investment, including in rural India, including on rural infrastructure. You see, one of the things that has happened in the neoliberal period is that there has been cut back on rural infrastructure investment, and we have to revive it. And of course, substantial increase in healthcare and education and so on. Now, all these are important areas of investment. In addition, it is also important for us to go back to the old slogan of self-sufficiency. I'll tell you why. It's not ideological alone, it's just common sense. If we have an active state that is interfering in generating employment and so on, in eliminating poverty, then you would have necessarily a revolt of finance. If there's a revolt in finance, you'll have to have capital controls. Control on financial outflows. If you have control on financial outflows, financial inflows are going to dry up. You are not going to get finance coming into the country if you put controls on its going out of the country. If it does not come in, then of course your balance of payments deficit, the current deficit, you will not be able to finance. Our imports are too high relative to our exports. That being the case, we have to put trade controls. If we put trade controls, then you'd have to have once more a revival of domestic investment in many sectors, like Mahalanobis had talked about, a revival of domestic investment in many sectors, which we have now got used to importing from outside. It will become important for us to produce those domestically. The self-reliance has gone down. We have to once more build it out of necessity.
This is the last question. I'm afraid that members who have asked other questions, he can't address because he has a time commitment. So this is the last one. From Avadh K. Post-pandemic, I see a large number of countries move into junk status. Maybe he's talking about bonds. This will limit their ability to borrow. When such a situation emerges, I see bankruptcy of countries and an economic pandemic worse than COVID. Do you see this happen? And if so, what will be the way out?
Yes, absolutely. You see, the point is, as I mentioned, that the increase in third world indebtedness began because of the, well, some indebtedness was always there. The increase began, it really took off after 2011 with the collapse of primary commodity prices. Okay, now what is happening is that in many of these countries you have to have pandemic related expenditures, but on the other hand the revenues have gone down, so the governments have no way of making payments which are for debt servicing, external debt servicing. That being the case, the argument is that, look, give us some debt relief. And as a matter of fact, last month you must have seen the G20 agreed to a certain degree of debt relief. Now, debt relief is just not good enough, because of the fact that, okay, it's just not good enough because it only postpones the debt. So that after the period of debt relief is over, you have a huge accumulation of debt which has to be serviced, and that is something that becomes again impossible. But even if you had a debt write-off, which of course would be the real solution to this, even if you had a debt write-off, that itself would not be enough as long as you have third world countries which are actually having large current account deficits. So I would suggest that we have to go back, if we are really thinking in terms of a solution to the global problem, to something like the Brandt Commission report. The Brandt Commission had talked about the advanced countries handing over every year 1% of their GDP to the poor countries. By the way, I should tell you that the debt the debt service relief which was offered by the G20 last month to the 77 poorest countries of the world these 77 poorest countries' total debt amounts to 1% of the GDP of the G20. And as a result, if they wrote it off, the Brandt Commission wanted every year for them to give 1%. But of course, if in any given year they just give 1%, the current debt would just be written off. So it would become important then to actually have some way of ensuring that there is, because any fall in the terms of trade, as far as the poor countries are concerned, is really something which hands over gratuitously their commodities at low prices to the advanced countries or to the consuming countries. And therefore, they should compensate them by paying a certain part of their GDP as a transfer. And that's what the Brandt Commission asked for. Willy Brandt, that 1% of GDP of the advanced country should be just handed over every year as aid, grant, no loan, as a grant to the poor countries of the third world. I think some such arrangement would have to be made if we are going to get rid of the problem of debt.
It's very good of you, Professor Patnaik, to give us an hour of your valuable time. I'm very sorry to members whose questions couldn't be asked because of lack of time. And now I would ask my colleague on the Library Committee, Professor Chaitanya Mitru, to give the official vote of thanks.
Good evening, everybody. The Library Subcommittee members, the chairperson, and the president of the club join me to thank Professor Prabhat Patnaik profusely for helping us to think with more clarity the learned perspectives of neoliberalism with an instinctive ease of his brilliant and cultured mind. I would like to thank the organizers who created the platform for this brilliant talk, and of course my colleague Mr. Sarojesh Mukherjee, who introduced and took the question answer through. Thanks to everybody who had joined us for this. With this, the program of today comes to a close. The virtual library talk of Bengal Club is completed with this. Goodbye and good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.